afternoon, and welcome to this today webinar that we will be having today and tomorrow. My name is Laura Fernandez. I am Program Coordinator at LAB Matadero. I will speak in Spanish just for one moment to welcome everyone also in Spanish. Bienvenidas todas y todos a este seminario online de presentación de proyectos del LAB Medios Sintientes. Vamos a desarrollar este seminario principalmente en inglés, ya que algunos de los ponentes y de los proyectos que se presentan no hablan en castellano. Entonces va a ser la mejor manera de podernos entender todos, pero bueno, esperamos que esto no sea un inconveniente y que todos lo podamos seguir. Aún así, quizá algunos de los proyectos que se van a presentar sí que hagan su presentación en castellano, si sus promotores se sienten así más cómodos. Y en cualquier caso, para todas las personas que lo estéis siguiendo online, si queréis enviar vuestras preguntas, podéis hacerlo a través del chat también en castellano. I will switch to English again. As you already know, the main purpose of this webinar is to present the 8 projects that have been selected through an open international call and which will be developed collaboratively in a prototyping workshop under the topic of Medios Sintientes, sentient media. This workshop will be held at LAB Matadero in Madrid from the 21st of April to the 4th of May this year, and will be conducted by 3 mentors, which are Abelardo Gil Fournier, Nerea Calvillo, and the Quadrature Collective. The idea of presenting the projects in this webinar is that anyone interested in taking part in the workshop can know more about those projects so that they can apply to the open call for collaborators, which is open now and which will be open until the 3rd of April. So if you want to be part of the team that will develop any of these 8 projects that will be presented today and tomorrow, you can apply to this open call. It is interesting to remind that Media Lab will cover travel and accommodation expenses for 8 projects coming from outside Madrid. So today we will have the presentation of 4 projects. And after each of these presentations, there will be some time for questions or comments. So if you are following the webinar and would like to ask something, please use the YouTube chat to send your questions. And the team will collect the questions and will help them to the speakers. In addition to these 4 projects, we have the pleasure of having 3 great invited speakers with us today. Whose work deal with issues which are related to the topic of Medios Sintientes. And we're going to present the first of these invited speakers, Jussi Parikka. Jussi is professor in digital aesthetics and culture at the Aarhus University. And he's also a visiting professor at the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague. His work addresses a wide range of topics that contribute to a critical understanding of network culture, aesthetics and media archaeology in contemporary society, as well as the politics and history of new media, cultural analysis of new materialism and media theory. So Jussi, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Let me just first, before I speak anymore, also try to share my screen. Let's see, I think this one should be the right one. Right, I think it's visible. Yes, let me just put it on full screen as well. So yes, I just want to say first thank you. Thank you. I'm going to put on a note to myself about time to make sure that we're on schedule. I really want to kind of start with a thank you. I realize that obviously we've been, so many of us have been able to be in dialogue with you Laura, with Eduardo, with Tiga, with Luisa, and I'm super keen to hear the projects today. This will be a really delightful event, I know already. I want to, although, start with a note that, it is at the back of our brain anyway, and it's difficult to continue business as usual, or even business, as usual, in the context of the war in Ukraine and Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I feel that it's good to, in this context, also remember how grateful we need to be able to discuss amongst each other in this context, but also sending our solidarity to Ukrainian people and Ukraine, but also Russian resistance in this context as well. I'll talk about something related to our topic, though. I'll talk about, I'll offer this short talk as a little mediation on questions of sense and sensing in ways that refers to some of the earlier work that I've been doing, but also some of the things that I hope will resonate across the projects that we will listen today, which really sound amazing, to be honest, based on all of the titles. And I wish I could have been more involved already earlier with the work, but glad I'm now. I hope that my talk, because I'm pulling material from earlier work of mine, won't be too repetitious, but I thought that it could be acting as a sort of a showcasing of questions of non-human sensing, as well as link to critical post-humanities, and as such make sense for the ways in which we think of theory and practice today and tomorrow. Like in many other contexts, I feel this connection between media theory, cultural history, and current design and artistic practices, they really become a fruitful way of approaching the issues. It has for sure also influenced the other way around of how we discuss media studies and media theory in proximity with experimental practices, and how the theoretical topics can have a role to play in educational and practice-based situations as well. I'm currently, often I sort of relate to media studies, but at the moment I work in the Department of Digital Design and Information Studies. So I'm also sort of switching these multiple kinds of views in terms of disciplinary alignments in my own work as well. And I want to repeat the often mentioned mantra that theory is also a praxis, which highlights the role of concepts and theoretical, historical knowledge and topics, how they can play a role in framing questions of, for example, sensing across different scales. This is also already the mode of investigation we do with my collaborator, Rahil Fournier, who was mentioned, who's been a part of, again, of these projects as well as a mentor, which is fantastic. And I believe also spoken about some of this work in a different earlier context. He already spoke with the group, but also he might have mentioned also our joint project on scales of sensing and surfaces of imaging and sensing and growth. So I'm not going to talk about this current work that we're doing with Abelardo so much. Most of my work has been on technological cultures, although I'm very much in the same boat as Shannon Matton when arguing that narrow models of computing and sensing or technological sensing won't be sufficient when dealing with the breadth of layers of what is sensing as well. This can be read against certain corporate technological visions of the smart city, but also it can be read to broaden the focus and scale of what is counted as sensing, to emphasize exactly this sort of a complexification of sensor regimes and planetary technologies has been proposed by many others already, by Jennifer Gabrys, Benjamin Bratton, and many others. So in a way, the context is already well defined, as we know. With Shannon, we developed similar perspectives in some of our joint work as well, in a curatorial context in 2019, in Finland, when we co-curated a small show at the Oodi Library, which was then just new, just opened in Helsinki under the rubric of Libraries' Other Intelligences, play with the notion of AI, not just as artificial intelligence, but as ambient, architectural, alien, animal intelligence, and more. We work with 3 artists to make the library itself into a sentient entity of audiovisual performances, infrastructural tours, and experimental alien languages. So our artists, Jenna Sutela, Tuomas Laitinen, and Samir Boumik, staged different projects that all dealt with this alien nature of the non-human as language, as soundscapes, as the infrastructural backdrop of an intelligent building. So in this vein, I want early on to outline that I find also curatorial contexts useful in outlining some of the scales in questions of sense and sensing that I will address briefly today. The case of Audi, the art project and the sort of architectural site was related to exactly architectural scales, the new public library and its technological infrastructure. But finding ways to narrate and rethink and reimagine that space was part of the curatorial way of thinking. What is sensing? A bit later, I want to think through some of the curatorial context of something I've been doing recently with Daphne Dragona, namely the Weather Engines exhibition that opens in Athens soon. And from this perspective of sensing as well, weather systems and technologies as questions of large-scale dynamic sense and sensing of complex entities that are formed in and through their own sensing as intensity. So in other words, I'm kind of will not do any kind of a heavy theoretical talk, but I'm interested in ending up with a punchline that sensing is also formative of those entities that do the sensing as well in a recursive loop. So I promised 3, and I will try to deliver 3, namely the 3 themes or scales or case studies that I'll briefly talk through, which include insect media, planetary sensing or geology of media, and indeed this curatorial way of thinking about sensing through many collaborative projects as well. So in terms of, I wanted to start by returning to insect media, which is my work from over 10 years back. In this discussion, that seems to respond well to the focus on sensing as well. It was a book that was written still in the context of media studies in a way, but already with a significant element related to questions of design and art and architecture in a particular cultural historical period of 150 years. In short, this book claimed to be a sort of anti-Marshall McLuhan book, at least an anti-McLuhan argument that media are not extensions of man, definitely not the male man, and the sort of a limited, narrow scope of design projections that we know from a history of Western thought quite often as well. Media are not extensions of man, but extensions of broader regimes of natural techniques that are often discussed through animal metaphors. Hence, the insect theme was carried over into a historical inquiry as well that started from birth of modern entomology in the 19th century, but it was not meant to be mere analysis of metaphors, but actually a sort of a mapping, a cartography of design plans or projections of mathematics and cybernetics. In other words, the world of technological modeling that actually took quite often its reference to animal worlds or non-human animal worlds and as its way of understanding what technology is. And it ended up with quite interesting, at least I find it, I'm not talking about my work is interesting, but the references to, for instance, recent years of new materialist feminism, where similar themes of sensing beyond the human form became adapted as what Rosie Braidotti calls post-human feminisms as well. In some ways, insect media could be read as a cultural historical map of scientific, but also literary and artistic ways of framing insect and other animal sensing as alien intelligence. The olfactory, in other words, the things about, and I'm sniffing here, but it's because of allergy, I think, the olfactory, but also the chemical and other forms of communication that entomological sciences mapped, and that were of key interest to 19th century scientists, but also popular science writers. They were carried forward, for example, to surrealist work of rereading aesthetics and sensing beyond a normalized human form. So the idea to investigate historical modes of sense with compound eyes, movement with 6 legs, and the sort of work around easily mysticized crowd intelligence that emerged in ant research of early 20th century were examples of rethinking the networked form beyond a technical definition. So the scientific fields and sometimes slightly less scientific takes on entomology, but also ethology and others were part of this philosophical investigation into history of technology and history of technologies of scale and scaling and sense that emerges in relation to a particular non-human animal realm. I have emphasized in more recent times that this is my AI book of sorts, in the sense of outlining animal intelligence as the modus operandi of what the A stands for beyond modeling of intelligence as it emerges in the confines of current AI research as well. This is not necessarily obviously opposite to any kind of some of the strands of how we understand AI now, especially earlier artificial life research as well, considering, for example, how distributed sensing and intelligence became a theme in robotics since the 1980s, and how this riffs with certain strands of cybernetics as well. Software entities modeled on principles of learning became experimented in the 1980s and onwards. And one form of basic connection between intelligence that is not about knowing, but about learning, obviously, and bootstrapping intelligence into a milieu through which one learns. Furthermore, the sort of cognitive science interested in cognition distributed outside the brain or without even, in contexts such as insects, connected to the world, and thus also creeping outside the tight sensorial skin of any human body, becomes one version of the theme of insect media. What other modes of sensing are bootstrapped into a discussion of media than the McLuhan standardized human, and as such becoming a critique of figures of man, again in the vein of critical post-humanities as well. Now, even with the risk of rushing through many complex contexts way too quickly, and I do that way too often as well, of sort of a somewhat rushing many things that need unpacking, but let's do it in the interest of time. I want to mention the work in Geology of Media as well, a book that followed insect media, and it was third part of the so-called media ecology trilogy of books. First one was Digital Contagions on computer viruses and accidents, then on insect media, and then Geology of Media. In this context, the focus on planetary dimensions of advanced technologies amounted to a paradoxical claim that media history is Earth history. Media history is Earth history as far as it concerns identification, extraction, use and reliance on resources from rare earth minerals to fossil fuels. The petro-cultural drive of technical media is one trait of the book, while the other was decisively focused on scales, and hence I wanted to again point out that I want to lift scales into my title of the talk, also because it's a really key concept that we're working with Abelardo at the moment. So in this case, it was also about what geographical scale is media distributed on, at what temporal scale do we consider its effects beyond use. As such, Geology of Media was and could be read as one response to the question about planetary scale and planetary scale sensing. Perhaps it corresponds in a way to Earth Layer in Benjamin Bratton's stack, but it also relates to the broader issue of medium design as identified by Keller Easterling. In other words, what are the conceptual and practice-based ways of dealing with design that is environmental, that is not merely focused on particular objects, and that is able to account for the material energies already in place, already in flux, already shaping environments, already shaping sensing and perceptions and more. At this point, it becomes clear that there is a trait of recursivity in questions of sensing that I will return to later, but it relates to how any act of sensing is already also informing the entity of sensing in question as well. Sensing is an informative event. For those of you interested in philosophy, I'm sort of echoing Simon Don here, that is born out of individuating resonances. But here you can observe how it riffs with insect media as two different kinds of attempts to think about where sensing is being observed. Where does sensing take place? I hope that it also resonates with the work that is being presented in our event, work that conceptualizes, visualizes, thinks through, and thinks with planetary movements, whether those of insects, of data streams, of different layers of energetic transfer, that becomes included in the broad spectrum of mediations. What I will leave this with slightly less attention in this talk is though the actual operational images that define the scope of this scale of planetary media. This includes different ways of understanding volumetrics of the underground as per resources and as mapping resource extraction, the sort of images that are not images in the normal sense, that and in this case, they employ multi and hyperspectral imaging, as in remote sensing, the format of images that is operational, to echo Harun Farocki's quite often used term, which becomes central to a range of institutions from military, but also to environmental observation, including also then this extractive industries as well, as proven really well in multiple other people's work, like Götze and Al's work on operational images of extraction as well. And this sort of images of the world as data and as part of pipeline of logistics, from the data sets to training sets to machine learning models, and sometimes in relation to particle extraction operations as well. This is something that I deal with in my next book that is with the publisher now and in production. It should be out in early 23, which is simply titled Operational Images. And also, as a further nod, Tiga Brain's work was really inspirational for some of the work that I did in this one. So I'm really happy to be on the same panel on the same day as Tiga. Number 3, to be on time. I want to kind of move, as mentioned, a bit quickly, but still across these three different examples and 3 different scales that all have to do with sensing. And this is something that is sort of work in progress, or sort of work just about to be released into the wild, and that you can find if you Google weather engines as well, but I'll link it to our questions today. Approaching questions of planetary design and transdisciplinary arts, and for example, operational images, this is one focus on how questions of scale come up in my work as well. What is scale of sensing? That is not merely located on the axis of, small, large, or other pre-formatted measures of scale in that sense, but scale as about dynamics of formation, of information. Without losing sight of new forms of technical sensing, I'm interested in this sort of a parallax view where techniques of sensing are read in relation to histories and case studies of materials, of knowledge formations that somewhat seem off the beaten track, and which can still offer inspiration for the sort of work we do in practice as well. And again, the sort of wonderful presentations that we're going to hear about soon as well. Different figures of natural sensing are embedded in the artificial systems, but to propose the cascade of figures of sense and sensation is also about feeding insights into aesthetics, how these projects can themselves build into a sense of an aesthetics as well, that is up to the task of making sense of our current situation. For example, to riff with I.L. Weisman and Matthew Fuller in their recent book on it, and their recent take on aesthesis, with other human forms of sensing, as what other forms of other than human forms of sensing can be ways of augmenting and playing, expanding and testing also what human sensing means. So in other words, we're constantly interested in this feedback loop of what is human and in which ways it's being augmented in environmental contexts. Sorry about the sniffing again, it's indeed allergy. Curatorial work is anyway in fundamental ways about creating patterns of sense and sensing across concrete spaces. I don't need to tell you this, many of people here, also our hosts, are experts in these questions of thinking with space. I already gave a glimpse of some of the curatorial work earlier, but now in the last section, I want to return to a sort of a framing that happens in curatorial narrative, spatial thinking, and artistic projects that work as part of our theoretical methods as well. We are opening soon in Athens, April 1st, the exhibition at Weather Engines, curated by myself and Daphne Dragona. The project started some 2-3 years ago, and it consists of an exhibition, a book, and a public program of talks and workshops and performances that deal with different modalities of weather. From advanced data and machine learning and even geoengineering technologies of weather to other modalities of embodiment, sense, as well as politics, we offer a particular atmosphere that itself becomes addressed as part of elemental politics. I won't talk through all the artworks, there's more than 20 of them, but I want to give a brief window to our way of thinking and how it intersects with our theme today. In the last sort of 8 minutes that I got left. In the context of weather engines, I want to propose 3 interlinked ideas, and this is not just a full description of our curatorial thinking. So, but it's some of the interesting ideas that we've been putting together as well. Or there would have been also the curatorial note. Anyway, you'll find it online. Firstly, the first idea is that, and this apologies might be obvious as well, history of meteorology, history of weather, history of weather sciences of weather or knowledge about weather. And only this is, of course, one particular Western instance as well, is already full of examples of what could be easily called machine learning or data sciences, at least, distributed networks of sensing and observation, as well as compilation of data points understood gradually also in the mathematical equations aimed at forecasting. That would be one version of trying to summarize in one sentence more than 100 years of meteorology. As documented in so many great books already, such as Marc Monmonier's Air Apparent, meteorology, even before the computational methods of 20th century, was really involved in particular kinds of data-driven forecasting that senses not only the here and now, but builds models of potential pathways, events, and patterns. For example, the late 19th century storm tracks and weather forecasting by Frank Bigelow consisted of a data set of what we would now call a data set of 1,133 past storms that were recorded between 1884 and 1893 in order to compile a statistical understanding of possible or likely patterns across geographical space of the US per month. Here's an example. The observational data meant for comparison was thus already seen as part of a pipeline of gathering data of past events in order to model possible future ones. Secondly, weather, to state the obvious, relates to techniques and technologies of war and colonialism in ways that makes the quest for decolonizing weather more than an empty metaphor. We sometimes use decolonizing slightly metaphorically, but as we know and reminded by great scholars, it shouldn't be a metaphor as such. It's an actual, an actual context of violence. The sort of military context of measuring, knowing, and also engineering weather is one backdrop to the history of imperialism and weather. And here also the questions of sensing become part of the drill. What are the politics of sensing that also encompass the broader question of geopolitics and colonialism? Of current work in this vein and in our exhibition, we can mention GeoCinema Art Duo's take on the Chinese remote sensing infrastructures and the data platform of Digital Belt and Road, DBAR, as part of discussions of colonialism and data, as well as such fantastic cinematic works as Barbara Marcel's project Cinecipo, that takes the Amazon Tall Tower as its central architectural feature, but works its way through with indigenous activists who temporarily occupy it and transform it into a community radio site. Hence, techniques and technologies of weather are also sensorial regimes that also need to link up with questions of climate justice. Thirdly, the broader sensorial regime of weather as well as climate research leads to think of sensing as dynamic interaction of events and processes. This is not only about object-based models of sensing, but about dynamic systems as defined by this complexity of interaction and sensing incorporated into their emergence as wind, as waves, as pressure, as humidity. At the back of work in cultural theory on atmospheres and violence, from Fanon to Christina Scharf via Achille Membert, and environments of interaction in movement, such as Masumi and Manning, as well as the earlier mentioned topics of medium design. We are really kind of a push to understanding that the model of sensing itself is a complex network of layers of sensing that also sense their own sensing as well. In other words, they are formed in that operation of sensing, which itself becomes political affect, it becomes an atmosphere, it becomes the ways in which we understand the dynamics of these different scales of sensing across, again, registers of politics and aesthetics. We do not only sense a cloud, a temperature, humidity, but they are formed in sensing operations in the first place as such, in atmospheric chemistry, but also in these other registers of political affect as well. This recursive trait of sensing is a significant part of what I am interested in as aesthetics of weather. It emerges out of its own sensing of surroundings as a dynamic system that becomes an atmosphere of living in a fundamental sense that is close to critical post-humanities and as appreciating this interface of not merely humans and their milieus of living as well. I don't have much time, so I'm going to really just scroll through the many really interesting projects like Manifest Data Labs carbon topologies about data visualization, data concretization of carbon topologies to design Earth's ways of understanding the planet after geoengineering that we know from many contexts by way of their animated work and images. Matthias Fritsch's living installation of mycelium garden that itself creates an environment by the fungi that are in the installation, so creating microclimates as such, as a form of sensing, right? To many kinds of performative work in the context of, for instance, feminist performative work like Aphrodite Psara and Audrey Briot's listening space, that itself links up with weather infrastructures and forms these bodies of sensing, to multiple other kinds of works like Proxic Climates, which deals with, well, relevant to my current state, with pollen, and as a particular form of an archive of past climates and future climates as well. We also edited a glossary which expands on these themes, including of themes of sensing, called Words of Weather, that is out probably next week in English and in Greek, that you can order through Onassis, I believe, that sort of expands on these discursive factors that relate to physics, affects, and politics, from air and atmosphere to tropics, waves, wind, and whatnot. As final words, to conclude, as forms of sensing, I want to bring this recursive trait into our discussion as well through these historical cases and of examples of sense and sensing. So the work from insects to planetary geophysics, geology, as well as weather becomes emblematic of this interest that is political and aesthetic into processes of sensing as they are fundamental to our lived condition. I would be so happy to continue more questions emerging in relation to Weather Engines exhibition, but I want to give the floor to our wonderful projects that are going to be interesting, wonderful, and insightful examples of sensing in their own right. So I want to thank you, and again, thanks to the wonderful organizers and my colleagues in this event as well. Thank you. Stop sharing. Laura, you muted.
Laura.
Sorry, I was muted. I would say thank you very much. You see for this really inspiring talk with so many references. I think there are so many interesting connections with ideas and projects that have been shared with us and the projects that are going to develop in the workshop. That it can be like very nice to keep the conversation with you. So I have some time at the end of the session for questions by the audience if it is possible. But for now, we are going to move on to the first project that is going to be presented, which is called Seno Image Dataset, and it's going to be presented by Mar and Miguel Rangel Gallardo. This project is making this question, can non-representational algorithms help us to build imaginary beyond gender? Seno Image Dataset aims to generate virtual material devices that allow us to hack the hegemonic visual imaginary by refunctionalizing image databases in order to disarticulate image management technologies. So they are going to tell us more about the project. Please, Mar and Miguel, it's your turn.
Hi. Thank you very much, Laura, for the presentation. Well, let's share our screen. Yes. There is, right? I'm ready. Well, hello everyone. First of all, we would like to give you a little insight on who we are, so you get to know us a little better and also on what we do. As Laura has just stated, my name is Mar, and I'm here with my mate, Miguel Rangel. We are both a couple of artist researchers, and we've been thinking together since 2019. Our work is focused on the problematic issues related to digital technologies in the current on-life context. In our most recent projects, we are interested in the visuality of artificial intelligence and gender studies. These projects have been presented in various exhibitions and events in Madrid and Valencia. For the time being, we are both currently studying the Master in Visual Arts and Multimedia at the Polytechnic University of Valencia. Now, for the project, we present to you Seno Image Dataset, and its objective consists of the refunctionalization of image databases through a xenofeminist lens via the elaboration of devices that alter and stimulate visual imaginaries with the help of AI in order to disarticulate image management technologies. So let's jump into it. As you can see, these keywords are the ones that summarize the project: visual epistemes, databases, xenofeminism, artificial intelligence, and refunctionalization. Now, can non-representational algorithmic images help us build imaginaries beyond gender? And can we refunctionalize sentient media in a xenokit? These are the questions that motivate our project. By their initial configuration and productive genealogy, automated digital technologies tend to reproduce the regime of visual categorization through their predictions, suggestions, and prescriptions, right? There is an algorithmic non-neutrality in digital technologies, which replicate through their operability a vision that is far from reality. The image databases that configure the dominant visuality are the ones that regulate the processes in the internet. Machine learning, AI, or Internet of Things, all this technological corpus of sentient media is fed by images with gender rubrics that replicates algorithmic standardization and exclude all alternative subjectivity from both physical and also digital spaces. In order to stimulate the conversation around this topic, we consider the image generated by artificial intelligence an element of great performative, aesthetic, and transformative agency. In front of these images, our gaze is dissolved. This is a sign that our scopic regime can be disarticulated, that complex realities exist and continue to be generated, and cannot be understood through current visual epistemes. Therefore, relying on AI images, it may be possible for us to generate visualities free of a gender rubric, and that consequently do not function as support for systems of oppression of some bodies over others, but rather as potential identity operators arising from a representational vacuum. These will be considered the Seno images. In conclusion, Seno image dataset aims to generate operational devices, both physical and digital, that allow hacking the hegemonic visual imagery through their functionalization of image databases. We want to activate the useful future in the field of gender disruption by relying on AI as a new sensory visualization tool from a xenofeminist perspective. These are some formalization suggestions that we came up with. First of all, we consider xenoimage dataset as a friend in the speculative field. Working on producing images is a really complicated task, so we consider it convenient to propose several frameworks of action for this project, as you can see. We propose several starting points as the elaboration of a database of AI images that functions as a hacker tool or as a database for the construction of new tools. Also, another option will be the development of an online digital tool that transforms images from an existing database into AI images or xenoimages. And lastly, the construction of a physical digital image infection device to help us reformulate existing database and with the possibility of making it a portable physical prototype. These are only some of our suggestions, and we hope that given the nature of this workshop itself, which promotes collaboration among multiple agents, the proposals presented here will transform, mutate, and vary in new ways and unexpected results. We want to propose an open schedule that leaves rooms for the future interventions of the collaborators. That is one of our main goals. With this in mind, we propose the first sessions of the residency as spaces for conversations, debate, and brainstorming regarding the concrete formalization of the project. The materializations of the prototype will take place during the following days until the end of the workshop. Lastly, as for the description of the collaborator's profile, we consider that the presence of diverse profiles is crucial, from people with more technical knowledge to those who want to contribute with their vision from a life experience crossed by gender issues. These are some of the foreseen profiles, although the project surely welcomes the unexpected. From programmers with knowledge in databases to xenosubjectivities who want to contribute through their experience and located knowledge. Also programmers with knowledge in the elaboration of web pages, since we believe that a digital space could be a good starting point to place the prototype. And also people who work with images and or theorize about them. As we have just stated, the unexpected is more than welcome. So although your profile might not match the ones here, most likely we will be delighted to have you with us. And that's it. Thank you very much. We hope to see you all soon.
Well, thank you very much, Mar and Miguel. I don't know if there are any questions for them at the YouTube chat. If not, well, we will move to the next project, which is called Extrasensory Excesses, Imagining Inclusions with Discarded Data. And it's going to be presented by Tim Cowlishaw. The project is an investigation into the blind spots of sensory systems, which are already in place in the city of Madrid through their open data portal. And it proposes to investigate their politics and the exclusions they make, and also a way to speculate and make real alternative worlds that are more just and inclusive for human and more than human actors and agents. So please, Tim, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Laura. 1 second, I'm waiting for my slides to load. I'm not quite sure why my computer's being so slow. Let me refresh and see. Let's see what's happening here. Sorry, this is a presentations. We practiced this yesterday and it worked fine, but something seems to have gone wrong. Right. Present view. If I come over here and I'll share my screen. Perfect. Okay. Just advance portion of screen. And can you see this the title slide? Perfect. Okay. I will move this out of the way. Right. Sorry about that. Hi everyone. My name's Tim Cowlishaw. I'm a I guess designer, technologist, and researcher of various shapes. I've been working with digital media in various forms for a long time, and I'm currently enrolled in the PhD program at BAU in Barcelona. And my thesis is investigating digital wastes, by which I don't mean devices, kind of phones, kind of discarded material things, but rather looking at practices around discard of data, essentially, of images, of files, of things like this, as a way of understanding or a way of developing post-human perspectives on digital design, perspectives that go beyond use as a sort of guiding principle. So this this sort of fits within my interest as part of my PhD, and I think the thing that really captured my attention about the call was this idea of thinking about data infrastructures, thinking about sort of means of understanding the world via technology as sensory organs, as kind of the senses of a kind of communal body. And one of the interesting things about this, I think, is this idea of kind of societies or collectives as a body that's sort of defined collectively is quite an old one. This goes back to kind of Hobbes's Leviathan, and I think Durkheim as well had kind of ideas about a society as a kind of collective subject. And this idea that our kind of infrastructure can act as the sort of senses of that collective body, I thought was very interesting. In particular, I'm interested in how this kind of relates to more recent work, the kind of post-human turn, and thinking about life and about kind of biology, but also in design, because this sort of thinking about stuff like Lynn Margulis' endosymbiosis and the idea that it kind of calls into question the idea of individuals as a subject, as a kind of a cohesive kind of person, and kind of when we're assemblages of other lives, other agencies that kind of live within us. This both kind of complements this idea of the kind of the collective body, but it also problematizes it, because this which slide have you got? I'm so sorry, my computer is terrible. I hope we have the Leviathan again. If not, I will just carry on talking. This kind of both kind of like resonates with these sort of older ideas of kind of collective bodies, but also problematizes them, because this idea of the kind of the collective as a sort of human-like form made up of individuals kind of relies on the idea that the collective is a kind of cohesive subject with an individual agency, and that it is kind of made up of subjectivities which are kind of, I guess, hegemonic, which are kind of tend to be white, tend to be Western, tend to be male, and also importantly tend to be human. So my interest in the kind of the sensory side of this comes from a kind of, I didn't really have a kind of succinct way of putting this till Yussi's talk earlier, when he mentioned that sensing is also formative, that when we sense something, sensing things brings stuff into being, but it also brings these subjectivities into being. Like our senses to some extent form the kind of divide between the stuff that's included in the kind of the body or the self or the subject, and that which is left outside. So there's such a kind of, sensing is a form of classification. Like when we decide what we're looking towards, we're kind of deciding what gets included and what gets excluded. And when you think about this, when you think about society in these terms, you're thinking about questions of justice, questions of politics, question about who gets included in the kind of body politic and who gets to remain outside as a thing that is observed. So Yes, I've got ahead of myself, sorry. So it's the kind of selectivity of this is important. There's always this tension between the kind of standardization which is implied in infrastructure and in building this collective and the kind of needs of the individual within it. So what I'm proposing, I guess, is using this metaphor of the sensory apparatus of a society and a sensory infrastructure as kind of the support for this idea of a collective body, of a collective subjectivity. I think that helps us to understand questions of inclusion, questions of justice, by thinking more about the kind of the blind spots of this infrastructure, the things that are left out, the things that aren't sensed, and to think more about how we can identify the kind of neglected parts of our collective life, the things that aren't recorded, and how we can expand our idea of what it means to sense collectively in order to include the people, the agencies, the actors that are left out of that collective view. And in particular, given we're going to do this at Matadero, it will be interesting to think about this from the point of view of the city of Madrid and the city of Madrid as a collective. So, kind of concretely, this is going to be a kind of workshop in 3 parts, or a kind of task in 3 parts. And the first thing is this identification of blind spots, this thinking about the things left out of our ways of sensing, the kind of the exclusions. And one way to do this is to look at the Madrid open data portal. So there's a whole repository of kind of municipal information about all aspects of, or all kind of recorded aspects of life in the city of Madrid. And using some techniques which come from the Public Data Lab, who are a sort of collective of people working in the UK and Netherlands, but all over the world, looking at ways of identifying what is left out of these indexes, and in particular, who is affected by that, who is excluded by that, and what forms of life are therefore rendered invisible by their lack of capture within these systems we use to kind of articulate what it means to be a collective body. The second step from doing that is then to attempt to, to attempt to identify ways of bringing these excluded agencies, excluded people, excluded things into the collective body. And I would like to do this by a very open-ended process of inventing sensing mechanisms, inventing new ways of apprehending the world, new ways of making visible or recording things that were previously excluded. I'm thinking about this in a very, very broadly defined way. So we're looking at kind of creative interventions as a method. So any kind of form of performance prototype intervention is kind of acceptable here. What we're aiming to do is to make interventions within the city in which we're working that will highlight aspects of life that were previously rendered invisible. The third part of this is a kind of speculative part. So kind of joining together this idea that the senses constitute the body. I think after having kind of made visible things that were previously invisible, there is work to be done around thinking about how that affects kind of life in an ongoing way, how that affects the kind of the society we live in and the kind of futures made possible by revealing or by making visible previously excluded things. So we will continue from that point, reflecting on the new information we've gathered, the new kind of points of view we've made visible, and we'll take part in some speculative exercises to think about the kind of possibilities that affords, the kind of the ways in which life, society might be impacted by our attempts to include new points of view. Very finally, because I'm moment 30 seconds, a little note on the kind of participants I'm looking for. Much like the XenoImage dataset team, my main priority here is to be as kind of open as possible. I think this type of work benefits from having a variety of people with kind of like curiosity and kind of a willingness to participate in this type of creative work. However, I'd like to highlight that I think we're dealing with a very specific geographic location here. We're dealing with life within a specific city, and to that end, I'd really be keen to hear from people who have some sort of personal link with our kind of field of investigation, who either live or work or have roots in the city of Madrid, and in particular, any historically underrepresented collectives, particularly any marginalized people in whatever form. I think it would be very, very important to include kind of a diverse set of voices in this project. I guess one small note on that, I didn't include this in the proposal because again, it isn't a massive priority, but in terms of facilitating this, I think it would also, if there are people who have either kind of sociology, social research backgrounds who are particularly enthused, or anyone who does data science who is particularly enthused by this, even though I'm not specifically looking for participants with specific skills, there is definitely stuff on the kind of facilitation side that could do with that type of expertise. So if anyone is kind of grabbed by this and does have those specific skills, please get in touch. But otherwise, really anyone who is kind of enthused by this idea as possible and kind of has creative ideas to bring to the table would be perfect. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Tim, for your presentation. So we have listened to two of the selected projects. As you can see, they have very interesting proposals and a plan to develop it. But the projects are open, as you see, for the contributions of collaborators. So that's why we have this open call for collaborators, and they are looking for these different skills, profiles, but also different points of view and perspectives that can bring what these projects need to be developed during this prototyping workshop. So we encourage you again to look for this open call for collaborators and see more about the conditions and how you can apply. So we are going to move on now to the next invited speaker, and we would like to welcome Luisa Crossman. Luisa, we will be having an artistic residency at Media Lab for the coming month, and now she will be presenting us the work that she's going to be developing in Madrid. I'm going to briefly present her. She's an artist and writer. Her work spans installations, speculative design, education, and institutional dynamics with a special interest in infrastructural methodologies. She explores the feedback between forms of human organization, new technologies, and global and planetary systems. So please, Luisa, you can start.
Hi. I'm going to share my screen. So hello, I'm Luisa Crossman. I'm based in São Paulo, but was invited to be in Madrid for the next few weeks by Media Lab and Matadero. I would like to thank them very much for commissioning this residency and this new work, this new research that I'm going to be doing while there. And also for organizing this online event, so I can present a little bit what I'll be doing, but also to get to know all the projects that will also be happening while I'm there. And also it's great just to be in conversation with Juicy and Tega, which are very inspirational. I do have a small disclaimer. I have a not so mild case of COVID at the moment. So I apologize if I start coughing, because I start coughing when I start talking. And also if I have to take a break to sip some tea, but hopefully this will go smoothly. So the work that I'll be doing is, for now, is the working title is Atropos Sky. And the work is to propose to look into the sky landscape as a drawing of patterns from multiple perspectives and a few different methodologies. One can find in many books and films and usually in culture, the sky as this awe-inducing entity. The starry nights are very inspirational. The ethereality of the sky is quite mysterious, but at the same time, its solidity is very protective. And because the sky holds so many different qualities, so many different features, it has been a medium of many of humanity's investigations. So to look into these investigations will be my starting point for the research at Troposky. My main proposition at this point is to look at the sky as an interface, a place from where we can extract information, and we've been extracting information from a long time. So localization and positioning, for example, navigation, weather prediction, future telling like astrology, but also other traditions, theological myths, existential narratives. The sky has always been a medium through which we ask ourselves, what is our place, the combination of time and space in the cosmos. I would like to perhaps turn this question around and to investigate then how the sky is an interface, not of future visions or future times, but of our present time and our current narratives. Sorry, just a second. So this means looking at the sky through feedback mechanisms and understanding how it can inform possible visual narratives for climate indexes, such as the ones that you're seeing on screen from Bloomberg Green, but also climate modeling and climate managing. So policy making, for example, and geopolitical discussions. So this research actually comes at the development, excuse me, of previous projects and works in which I look into the technologies and systems relating to climate modeling and technologies, future narratives, and the infrastructure of prediction. So in the screen, you're seeing a few images of the Weather Report Girl. The Weather Report Girl was a performative lecture that I did on Zoom in the year of 2020 during the pandemic. The idea was basically to have two Louisas. One was the news anchor, which you're seeing with the green screen, and the other one was the reporter, the Weather Report Girl. It started as this one-off work, but now it has gone bigger into a research frame, which is also informing the Troposky research. It investigates the relationship between weather forecast formats and our imagination about this world and other worlds. So this performance specifically took advantage of the internet platforms such as we are now in Zoom to have the simultaneity of two Louisas in conversation. The idea was to develop through this conversation a series of a series of information about the history of the weather prediction and also how this informs the way that we look into the world and think about the planet. It also took special interest in the figure of the woman within this both infrastructural but also news media atmosphere. So the history of climate prediction, while it's told through the discovery of many men, used to actually use the work of a lot of women in the backstage as data processing and mathematicians in order to be able to compute the information that was acquired through the infrastructural and apparatus systems. It also investigated the idea that usually the Weather Report Girl would be this break in the news system, right? With very heavy news being delivered. And the weather was supposed to be this kind of more light moment in the news system, in the news media. Right now, the climate is our most pressing, urgent matter. So in the work, I also kind of play around with this idea of gender, of feminist studies, and how the information and infrastructure apparatus usually does a play of hide and seek with that. By the end of this work, I explored also how actually the weather forecasting and atmospheric sensing not only informs the way that we see Earth, but also exoplanets, which are planets that are beyond our solar system. How they actually create or help create images or places due to data processing, but also of storytelling, narrative, atmospheric creation. As I said, this work is actually now a broader research framework, which I'm actually thinking in the sense of this and the next slide topics. So the first is the idea of signals as the seventh sense. So we all know the basic 5 human senses. I'm leaving the sixth sense as a mystery. Each person can have its own sixth sense narrative. And the seventh sense then, as many authors, such as, for example, I would say here, Jussi, but Breton and others propose the sensor layer, this geological media layer. Excuse me. So that's basically the combination of all the apparatuses that provides us with information beyond our cognitive human capabilities. The other topic that I'm also thinking through this research is the idea of cosmic prototypes. So I'm very interested in this idea of creating cosmic prototypes, departing from a planet's atmosphere and to develop a narrative around its social organizations, governance, and infrastructures. So for example, one example is the Anahis planet, which is a moon planet developed in the book The Dispossessed by American writer Ursula Le Guin. In that story, the fact that the planet, which is a moon, had so severe conditions of atmosphere, but also geological humidity and etc., actually inform how the organization and the governance and the resources are managed. This is just another image. Excuse me. So the second project that also informs a lot this current research is Cosmos Law, which was a research project developed during the terraforming program at Strelka, together with Vlad Afanevzev and Elena Dejarnia. In this research, we looked at how the legal framework and governance models could be used to actually, the current legal framework and governance models of outer space could be used to replace an outdated way of managing resources on Earth. So the research looks into the history of land occupation on Earth and exploration of outer space, and it proposes after a model for which we can match the planetary conditions and planetary governance as a way to reverse the current climate change conditions. So we looked into how Earth expansion through the sea and also the occupation, usually through colonization methods, happened on Earth, how this helped shape a legal apparatus for the justification of occupation of land, how this actually afterwards was a framework that informed the legislation of outer space, and how the sensing layer of outer space, the ground segment, the orbits, and all of this is actually connected. So the basic question that we proposed during this research was, what if instead of looking as space as an expansion of Earth, we actually look at Earth as being part of space? So it's a kind of epistemological change in perspective that actually helped us build a holistic legal framework for managing Earth's resources, which we called Cosmos Law. So in Cosmos Law, we investigated how this terrestrial expansion and sea exploration led to this colonizing framework and later helped shape this outer space legislation. And now I would like to investigate on how atmosphere, airspace, and the sky can also be a figure in geopolitics. So the sky's landscape is pure movement. It changes colors, it changes density. It reveals the biochemistry of the atmosphere. So in which ways does the sky and the weather relate? How to create narratives based on these relationships? My initial idea is to use a methodology proposed by Lisa Messeri, who is an American anthropologist, who develops a methodology that she develops in her book, Placing Outer Space. She develops this methodology while looking into the relationship between astronomers, the telescope's satellite infrastructure, and data. And she proposes then 3 forms of observing: observing at, observing with, and observing from. For Messeri, observing at is to observe inhabiting the observatory. Excuse me. Inhabiting the observatory, the telescope. To observe, sorry, to observe, so observing inhabiting the observatory. To observe with is to observe with an apparatus located in space. And so here I'm going to quote her. There is no observatory to inhabit, so the astronomer instead inhabits a social technical network. And finally, to observe from is to observe from a specific theoretical and ideal point called Archimedean Point. According to Messeri, and I'm going to quote her again, when observing from an Archimedean point, an astronomer inhabits a cognitive space and imagine isolation, neither grounded on Earth nor accessible via a network. This Archimedean point is imagined by theoreticians who ask what Earth would look like as an exoplanet. Here, the observing eye is placed at such a great distance from Earth that when it looks back, Earth has dissolved into nothing more than a point. Can astronomers discern from this point that living beings inhabit the world? So I'm not sure how I'm going to transform this methodology, what I'll have to do in order to be able to observe at the sky, with the sky, and from the sky. But by filming, writing, and modeling techniques, I intend to try and inhabit a Madrid sky, as Messeri would say. Radical speculation will also be a methodology for my research, and events such as what happened last week in Madrid when the Sahara dust turned the sky orange could possibly maybe start a science fiction scenario. What would happen if our skies turned a different color? In August 2020, I was in São Paulo. I was in the middle of mounting a show, and suddenly at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky turned very dark and very reddish. It felt apocalyptic, as if the sky was bearer of bad news. And it was. It was smoke from criminal activity in the center of Brazil. The agribusiness was burning Pantanal, one of the last and most important environment reserves in the world, located in the center of Brazil. They were burning it in order to be able to plant more soybeans and raise cattle. So one usually don't consider the sky as the immediate medium for ground activities. Perhaps we should. And lastly, I'm also interested in bringing to the research, which gives it its name, the Atropos or the Fates painting from Spanish painter Goya, which is currently at the Prado Museum. Excuse me. So the painting depicts Las Parcas, which are mythical figures that control the destiny of humankind. So you can see here, Las Parcas, they usually have a thread which corresponds to human life, and they can cut it and shape it according to their will. And they are located against a sky backdrop, which I find quite interesting. I also find quite interesting that this painting is part of the black paintings for Goya. So the sky here and the atmosphere is very heavy, dark, and full of actual Goya's critical ideas and concerns towards Spain. The conceptual ideas of fate, time, control, and prediction present in this work, in the figures of 4 women, are key for a possible development of many of these research lines of work. Can a painting be a form of telescope, a form of satellite? How do sky patterns inform us about the current state of the world? Our observation techniques are instruments of narrative control and speculation. These are a few questions that I'm going to start my research with, and I hope that I can share with you more during the coming weeks. Thank you, and I'm sorry for all the coughing. At least it's on Zoom, so there's no risk of infection.
Well, thank you very much, Luisa, for making the effort to be here with us in your situation. It has been really inspiring, and we are really looking forward to meeting you in Madrid. And I think we can take advantage of your stay to make these connections with the prototyping workshop and the projects. And it can be very inspiring and helpful to have you there. So we wish that you recover very soon. We are going now to move on again to the other two projects that are going to be presented this afternoon. Now we will listen to the presentation of the project Real-Time World RAG, which aims to create a tangible real-time world RAG that visualizes current global conflicts by blurring the boundaries between traditional RAGs and technology. It's going to be presented by Zainab, Tariq, and Rita Eperjesi.
Thank you, Lara, for the introduction. We're going to share our screen. Yeah, should be working. So yeah, as Lara said, the project we're going to present is Real-Time World RAG. So I'm Zainab Tariq. I'm a creative technologist from Berlin, and this is Rita. She's also a creative technologist and a designer based in Berlin, but originally from Hungary. We also have in our team Anna, who is also a creative technologist, and we had Fanny, who is a psychologist and a designer. So yeah, what we aim to create is, as the name says, a rug. It's going to be a visual and tactile representation of the currently ongoing political conflicts by applying the semantic and the visual language of Afghan war rug. The visualization of these political conflicts and hotspots is going to be a real time, and we're going to represent it in kind of like an abstract world map.
Yeah, and we don't know if you're familiar with the non-real-time war rugs. So here are a few examples. And Fanny got fascinated by the topic that these rugs originate in Afghanistan. And after the Soviet Union invaded their country, the rug makers started to incorporate these elements and symbols of war in their art. Oops. And we find it fascinating also from the psychological point of view that these collective traumas happen and then they just turn into everyday objects and people even work on these traumas. And we are very curious about this topic and these symbols and everything. And we are quite privileged in our Central European position that wars are not part of our everyday lives. But like there's the Ukrainian situation, but even before we were thinking that there are wars in the world, but we are lucky in our bubble and it's so easy to ignore the fact that people are suffering in other places and there are wars. So we want to create an object which brings this cold reality of the outside world into our homes with a very warm and peaceful object. I don't know how peaceful it is, but it's a warm object.
So yeah, what we basically want to create is a two-layered rug. One layer is gonna be static, and the second layer is gonna be on top of it, where we have like moving parts of the rug. We call these moving pixels or soft pixels. So yeah, so basically it's going to be like war symbols, and then depending on where conflicts are happening in the world, those pixels will move. So how does it work? We will first of all get a data set of different conflicts in the world. For that, we will use this website, Global Conflict Tracker, which like shows in real time different conflicts happening all over the world, and also like we can get location of those conflicts through this website by data scraping.
Yes, and we want to create a real-time visualization of these conflicts on a map. We want to use the design and the symbolism of the original war rugs, and we want to have like an abstract visualization of the world map. And we want to put all these things on a rug. For that, we want tufting, like to create the rug, and we need physical computing to make things move. And we don't know if you're familiar with this rug making technique, which is new, and I watched so much Instagram videos about this. And the very ironic thing is that it's also made with a gun, and then it creates rugs.
Yeah, and like we were inspired by this artistic piece, A Million Times 288 by Humans Since 1982, where we can see like these clock-like elements moving, and we kind of like want to create something similar, but not exactly the same, to give you some kind of like a feeling where we're getting at. Exactly, and for like the mechanical part or the technical part of these moving pixels, we are kind of going to use motors that are connected to a microcontroller. So here it's kind of like an abstract visualization of a circuit, which is like only connected to two motors. We will use multiple motors, probably over 30 motors. That's why we are looking for also collaborators who are familiar with this kind of things like physical computing. So for the one person that would be good to collaborate with would be a person who is good with engineering, physical computing, and then another like developer who is familiar with Python development, who can connect these motors to the data. Third would be like someone who could help us with data scraping. Although we are familiar with it, we know how to do it, but we're not experts in it. So we would appreciate help in that as well. No, it's not working. No.
Yes, and this is it for today. And obviously, we would rather wish for peace in the world. So we hope our war rug will be just a static thing at the end. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zainab and Rita, for your presentation. I remind that you can send questions through the YouTube chat if you have any questions for the projects, or maybe any of the other projects or invited speakers, if they want to also to ask or comment on the projects. Of course, you can also do it. There is one project left after our last talk, which is the project called Life Trajectories, the Traveling Insects of the Earth. This project is going to be presented by Ebzuariba Hernandez Gomez and Daniel Marcial. The project is based on a system of detection and registration of trajectories and a collective mapping in public space, and will try to trace the routes of hymenopterans, lepidopterans, and beetles, different kinds of insects. The detection will be done by installing a camera device in one or several places defined by the mapping. They are going to tell us more about the proposal and the collaborators they are looking for.
Gracias por la introducción y a quienes siguen conectadas, conectados en esta transmisión. Hello, I am Heb, we are Daniel and Heb. We live in Mexico. Our project for the Medios Sintientes lab is a viral trajectories, the traveling insects of the earth. We are going to tell you a little about us and some characteristics about the project. Our families have a peasant origin, and even we were born and live in Mexico City, we have to return to our village to see our parents and grandmothers. In these trips, we have seen how the developing industry changed the natural environment. For example, there are fewer trees and more cattle and monocultures. You can see few beans, and it is common that farmers use chemical fertilizers. And finally, in our country, environmentalists are killed. Nosotros, Daniel y yo, vivimos ya en la Ciudad de México, sin embargo, tenemos, nuestra familia aún vive en distintos estados de la República, en Guerrero y en Oaxaca. Y cuando nosotros regresamos a visitarles, notamos el cambio en el ambiente. Hay menos árboles y hay más monocultivos, hay más espacios desérticos. Tú puedes ver que hay menos insectos. Es común que los agricultores y agricultoras usen fertilizantes químicos y bueno, en nuestro país se mata y desaparecen a personas dedicadas a defender el territorio. Thank you. For this project, we decided to focus in the insects because they are considered from an anthropocentric, general, and short-informed perspective as inferior life forms or insignificant lives. Nos vamos a centrar en los insectos porque desde una perspectiva antropocéntrica, general y poco informada son considerados como menores o vidas insignificantes. Bueno, varios de esos insectos. In a daily life, bugs are often considered disgusting. We kill them immediately on the first opportunity, like this. We call to the pest control worker. We consider them invaders in our houses. And some bugs are synonymous with dirt. Maybe they are so insignificant that we have not even noticed their extinction. La mayoría consideramos algunos insectos desagradables y en la primera oportunidad de su ruido los matamos. Y bueno, también llamamos rápidamente a la persona que se dedica al control de plagas, los consideramos unos invasores de nuestras casas. Then, according to the Research Worldwide Decline of the Entomofauna, a review of its drivers published in 2019, in the last decade, we experienced the extinction of 40% of the insect population in the world. The causes are the destruction of their habitat and its use for agriculture and urbanization, excessive use of pesticides and chemical fertilizers, and climate change. Bueno, hemos experimentado en las últimas décadas la extinción de cerca del 40% de la población de los insectos en el mundo y varias de sus, esto a causa más bien de la agricultura, la destrucción de sus hábitats para la agricultura y la urbanización, el uso excesivo de pesticidas y fertilizantes y por supuesto el cambio climático, lo cual afecta especialmente a los insectos que viven en climas tropicales. The extinction of bugs alters and will alter the life in all ecosystems of the world because they are necessary for the pollination process in natural control of plagues and are food of other species and play an important role in nutrient recycling for the restoration and the life of soils. Es muy importante la participación de los insectos en los diversos ecosistemas porque ellos son necesarios para el proceso de polinización. Ellos controlan de forma natural algunas otras plagas, también son el alimento de otras especies y quizá las cosas más importantes es que cumplen un rol muy importante en el proceso de cuidado y de restauración de los suelos. In this negative context, we propose to look down, to see where bugs care for their ways and record their trips in the places which we share with them, like a flower pot, gardens, the fruit field, parks, streets, walls in the city.
What are we going to do in this project? Well, the project is organized in two stages that occur simultaneously. These two stages are first a collective mapping in the public space and the developing on an electronic device. Bueno, ¿qué vamos a hacer? Nuestro proyecto lo dividimos en dos etapas que ocurren simultáneamente. Una que es un mapeo en el espacio público y otra el desarrollo de un dispositivo electrónico. About the collective mapping. Mapping in the public space will allow us to place the project in an effective geographical and political context in order to observe insects and its social dynamics. Through interviews and other observation methods, we are going to build precise guidelines for the second stage. The second stage is the development of an electronic device with machine vision technology. We want to capture, tracking, visualize the insects' trajectories. Bueno, el mapeo en el espacio público nos va a permitir situar el proyecto en un contexto afectivo, geográfico y político con el fin de observar las dinámicas sociales respecto a los insectos, cómo los ven la gente. A través de entrevistas y algunos otros métodos de observación, queremos hacer guidelines para la siguiente etapa, que es el desarrollo de un dispositivo con tecnología de visión artificial para traquear algunas trayectorias de insectos. Later, we will consider the best ways to use the information obtained by the two stages in order to achieve the project objectives. These ways would be notifications, tweets, graphics, installation. In the slide, we have an example for the graphics. For example, you can have a tweet bot connected to the camera for generate notification when an insect travel in some place. Bueno, nosotros queremos usar la información del mapeo para ver la manera en que la información obtenida por estas etapas va a ser mostrada, la cual puede ser notificaciones, gráficos, tweets. Aquí en este ejemplo tenemos un tweet como que podría ser generado por una cuenta bot conectada a un dispositivo con una cámara que cuando detecte, por ejemplo, el insecto volando, genera este tweet y de esa manera concientizar respecto a la importancia de la vida de los insectos. Finally, we will create a post in an open source platform like GitHub in order for the project to be replicated in other parts of the world. Queremos subir todos los resultados en GitHub para tener un post con la información para que otros puedan replicar el dispositivo en otras partes del mundo. And last, this is our collaborators profiles. We are looking for persons with some of this knowledge: web design, machine vision libraries like OpenCV, A4, programming, entomology, biology, or knowledge about insects and environmentalism. Este es nuestro perfil de colaboradores. Buscamos gente con algunos de esos conocimientos: diseño web, conocimientos de visión artificial, programación, entomología, biología, insectos o ambientalismo. This is all. Thank you for hearing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heb and Daniel, for your presentation. We are going then to move to our last talk with our last invited speaker. And it's a pleasure to present Tiga Brain. She's an Australian-born artist and environmental engineer whose work examines issues of ecology, data systems, and infrastructure. She has created wireless networks that respond to natural phenomena, systems for obfuscating fitness data, and an online smell-based dating service. Those are some examples of the work that she is going to present to us now. Thank you very much, Tiga Brain, for joining this webinar. We will listen to you.
Hi, everyone. Let me just set up here for you all. Okay. Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Fantastic. So thank you so much for the invitation and for all these amazing projects and all of the work I'm hearing about today. It's really inspiring. I'm an artist with a background in environmental engineering, and my work over the past decade has been concerned broadly with like the politics of technologies and how they structure our ecology and our relationships within the environment. So this is both materially, like think about how they redistribute resources, but also conceptually. So like what ecological imaginations do they produce? Do they foreclose? And you know, these underlying questions of like resource and imagination are also questions of like agency. So how do these systems reconfigure agencies in different ways? How do they change how we make decisions and how we act in our ecology? About 5 years ago, I started to, and all sorts of like experimentation with the use of artificial intelligence in the context of environmental intervention. You know, and so why is it such an evocative idea that we might automate and outsource ecological decision-making to AI? It's this sort of, there's an enduring argument here that like AI sort of offers a more robust, objective view of the world, that all that data must be doing something. And that an argument, as you see made on the screen here as well, is another argument is that it sort of depoliticizes or neutralizes decision-making. And so this is something that the first work I want to share with you today addresses and explores. It's called Asunder, made in 2019, and it was a collaboration with Julian Oliver and Bengt Sojan. And it responds to this growing interest in the application of AI to critical environmental challenges by situating this approach as a literal proposition. What's presented in this installation you see is an autonomous environmental manager, so that proposes and simulates and then models alterations to the Earth's surface. It produces what are often completely unacceptable and absurd results. And it combines machine learning techniques, so like statistical approaches, with sort of traditional environmental modeling techniques, which use, you know, more numerical approaches relying on, you know, physics and different methodologies. So the system starts with a selection of regions. We chose regions that were showing remarkable environmental change. So you see on screen like the expansion of the Athabasca tar sands in Canada, it's a big mine, and also the deforestation in Rondônia in Brazil. And the environmental manager then generates an ongoing series of large-scale geoengineering proposals for each of these regions, and I think there's about a dozen of them included in the work at the moment. We continually adding to it. And so it generates sort of engineering proposals through use of a GAN, or a generative adversarial network, a common technique for manipulating images using machine learning. So a GAN is a generative model that is trained on a large data set of images, and the patterns in pixels of the images are interpreted as rules that are then used to generate new images in the styles of those that are in the data set, but that are unique in themselves. So in Asunder, we trained a GAN on publicly available satellite imagery from Landsat 8. And the resultant software model is then used to generate this fictional satellite imagery, which is then projected, you know, at scale, becoming these sort of uncanny environmental engineering scenarios. And so the system generates a multitude of options for these selected regions on Earth. It then selects one and then proceeds to interpret the fictional land use, the fictional tile in land use parameters. So we actually take that GAN generated tile and attempt to interpret it in land use parameters that are then put into a climate model that is constantly running in the space and simulating the scenario in a sort of industry climate model. And so in this way, the work sort of also conspicuously puts these two approaches to computational modeling in direct dialogue, you know, the statistical and the numerical. The work's presented as this sort of large scale projection in the form of a data dashboard. And so we're also playing with how the, you know, this data driven perspective really shapes a sort of planetary imagination. You know, it gives this sense that you've got this all seeing view of the world. That, you know, there has been a lot of writing by folks like Shannon Matten about addressing this sort of dashboard view as well. But the dashboard here presents this sort of machinic fiction, you know, that might look fantastical, but are actually highly constrained, right? The images that are produced are actually highly constrained because they're coming out of this machine learning system. So like all machine learning, GANs can only produce imagery from the space of their training data. And in this way, Asunda is only able to reproduce colors and textures that existed on Earth in the period of time, you know, that captured by that Landsat 8 satellite. And it points to a sort of one of the crucial limitations of machine learning systems in that they're highly conservative. They assume the past can predict the future. And this system can only dream what it's seen. It can't envisage a world outside the space of its statistical model. But, you know, as we all know, climate change and the fact we're now breathing an atmosphere that's never been breathed by humans before, you know, assures us that future environments are certainly not going to be as any human or any machine learning system has known them to be. So Asunda sort of probes and explores the characteristics of existing methods and imaginaries for AI. In the context of environmental management. But in many ways, the work kind of extends the imagination of the present, right? It sort of extrapolates where we are now, this idea of, you know, machines automating our environmental decision-making in a sort of large scale, you know, large computational format. But, you know, what might be some ways that where we might hijack or reconfigure automated systems rather than simply extending where we are at present? And the other two projects I want to share today attempt this, right? And they attempt sort of producing an alternative imagination for thinking about automation in ecology. So this next work, Synthetic Messenger, collaboration between myself and artist Sam Levine. Similarly, it probes how automated systems shape our ecology, but through looking at the sort of media landscape and media systems. Specifically, like responding to, you know, the experience of living in a time of climate emergency, where this image on the screen you see was like what Manhattan looked like for several days last summer. It really felt like something was on fire, and this was smoke that was coming from the West Coast fires. So it was like a blanket of smoke stretching the American continent. And yet at the same time, you know, climate change still fails to regularly make headlines or stay in the front page news. I mean, this is changing as it's becoming more, I think, tangible. But like, for example, this was a sort of visualization that was being shared at the time on Twitter, showing, you know, attention given to sort of something Jeff Bezos was doing, space stuff and climate change. So, you know, there's this question of like, what role does media play in how we understand our ecology, I think is obvious here. And yet, of course, the business model of the internet means that news outlets are relying on revenue by selling ads alongside their stories. So the more traffic a story receives, the more money it earns. And there's this incentive to optimize news cover and journalism for views and clicks and signals that are assumed to indicate human engagement. So engagement data then also determines how stories are aggregated, shared, and promoted. And it creates amplification, often without human decision-making in the loop. So clicks and scrolls all determine the value of reporting on different issues, including issues, existential issues like climate. And so this work takes the form of a botnet. So a bot being an algorithmic process that is programmed to automatically carry out online activities, such as sometimes generating text or clicking on content or listening to keyword or hashtags. Basically, bots, are there to simulate human interactions with online platforms. And a botnet is a large number of these algorithmic processes running together. And so our botnet is programmed with the goal of artificially inflating certain climate news stories. Every day, the system searches the internet for recent news coverage of the climate crisis. And then these URLs are fed to the 100 bots, which each visit the articles and click on the ads running alongside them. So the bot drives traffic, synthetic traffic, to climate reporting, and in doing so, potentially amplifies this news, making this content more lucrative for the media outlets by generating ad revenue. Clicking on ads increases the value of these articles, and the hierarchy of articles on news websites is determined by this kind of data. So the question is, we were interested in whether this sort of intervention could be a way to encourage media companies to invest more resources into the stories and the topics that are appearing to drive more traffic. And so this project is basically like building one automated system to talk to another. So it's like bots talking to bots. And as our system attempts to draw more attention to the climate crisis, it also reveals that algorithmic logics are radically changing the production and consumption of media and reporting and shaping the narratives by which we understand the climate emergency. So we made the work as this kind of algorithmic performance for a festival in the Netherlands last year. And when the botnet's active, it sort of performs its activities in a Zoom call. So audiences could kind of join the Zoom call and sort of commune or observe the bots going about their business with these sort of hundreds of accounts of that were being controlled.
Scroll, click,
systems.
Click, scroll, click.
Scroll, click,
scroll, click,
scroll,
click,
Scroll, click.
scroll,
Scroll,
click,
click.
scroll,
scroll,
click,
Scroll,
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 click.
scroll, click.
So we had friends and volunteers donate hands and voices to each bot. So they're sort of animated using
click,
Scroll, click.
Okay, and so it continued on for like a whole week of this sort of uncanny Zoom call. I guess, we really started thinking about Zoom as a potential place for artistic intervention after 2 years of pandemic times. Okay, so the work also, was accompanied by this dashboard showing its activities. And so in running the botnet for 2 weeks, it visited over 2 million sites and clicked on over 6 million ads. So the media is a crucial space for translating scientific findings, holding corporate and government actors accountable, and for producing political pressure. And in these capacities, the media is therefore a critical space for determining the future state of our atmosphere. And, the fossil fuel industries have known this for a long time. So armed with lobbyists and enjoying support from media moguls like Rupert Murdoch, the fossil fuel industry has worked to control the climate narrative. They know that whoever controls the media cycle has an outsized capacity to control the carbon cycle. And so media manipulation strategies backed by the fossil fuel industry are well documented, and there's been a few recent books out, by Michael Mann, for example, that sort of document some of these techniques, like promoting stories that sort of promote inaction, like it's too late to do anything, framing emissions reductions as an individual problem rather than something that needs to be addressed at an industry level. Sharing misinformation and so on. And there's the sort of famous story of the BP marketing team in 2004 inventing the carbon footprint calculator that frames the climate crisis as on this sort of at an individual level. And so, this is a provocation to see media as a form of climate engineering, or a potential place for climate engineering, a place where narrative becomes ecology. Computational media not only influences how the climate emergency is understood, of course, but it also quite literally contributes to emissions and electricity demand. So heavy media like streaming, virtual reality, the metaverse, NFTs, the whole bingo card of the sort of things that people are excited about in new media at the moment. These are all like very heavy computational processes that contribute to growing energy demands and are manifestations of the trajectory towards this expectation of ongoing growth in computation, right? So from the very inception of this field of computer science, you know, there's been these foundational ideas like the Turing machine with its infinite roll of tape that produces this imagination for computing being infinite, right? It's at the very beginning of the field. There's this infinite roll of tape. You know, imaginaries for personal computing also emerged in the 1970s around the time of the national oil crisis, at a moment where like planetary limits were really coming into, you know, public consciousness, right? And this is the decade where computing was really becoming personal and taking a format that's more familiar to us today. So there's this idea that, you know, computing is a response to trying to overcome planetary limits. And so the final work I'll just quickly speed through today because I know we're nearly at time, is called Solar Protocol, and it examines and is a response to this question of like, what could computing look like and what could media look like if it was taking planetary limits seriously? Like, what might low carbon culture look like? It's a collaboration also with a couple of people I am here with at NYU, Benedetta Piantella and Alex Nathanson, and a whole host of volunteers around the world. So Solar Protocol takes the form of a network of solar-powered servers that are all positioned and hosted, stewarded by different people around the world. And each of the web servers can direct the traffic in the network depending on whichever server has the most sunshine or is generating the most solar energy. And so when you visit solarprotocol.net, your web traffic is sent to whichever server is in the most sunshine at the time, as a way of also exploring, yeah, like automation by the environment rather than by sort of machine learning. So the solar servers look something like this. We were super inspired, and this kind of work was catalyzed by the low-tech magazine Solar Powered website that they published around 2018, I think it was. So we started messing around with these servers. And in building this network, you know, we have sort of built relationships with lots of people around the world. Each is set up in a different time zone and a different weather system, which obviously also determines how the logic of the network operates. Here are some of our stewards. I'm not going to play the videos, but yes, they're really, we depend on them to sort of do this work. And we really aim to have sort of servers set up across as many time zones as we could around the world. So obviously that's going to make the network more robust as the sun moves across the planet, or the planet moves across the sun. Or, anyway, the network works by reconfiguring the domain network, the domain name protocol, the DNS protocol, domain network protocol. And so DNS is a decentralized system that associates URL address with IP address. So like the name you type into your browser with the IP address of the server. So it's essentially telling your computer where to send its request, right? Based on IP address. And so for large scale, high volume web services, the DNS protocol will typically send network traffic to whichever server gives it the closest response time. So for example, if you make a Google search, your request is probably sent to a Google data center nearby. And so this prioritizes speed over other factors that determine how a network operates. Again, this is a characteristic that, you know, is very familiar in digital culture, but it doesn't have to work this way. And so Solar Protocol is built with this logic of the sun, based on the sun. Each server checks in to see if they're in the most sun at the time, and then they become the active server in the network. So they sort of take over the DNS of the network and requests are sent to their IP address. And so this changes throughout the day. You know, it's been winter here in New York, so our servers here have not been the active server very much. But this also means that we're deciding where to move computational activity in the network based on where there's the most naturally available energy. rather than what would produce quickest results for the user. So it sort of moves beyond this idea of like user-centeredness. And so in other words, Solar Protocol uses the distribution of sun to determine the DNS and the way that network traffic's directed. And so coming back to this question of intelligence and AI, you know, if intelligence is this capacity to sort of like synthesize a logic and apply that logic to make decisions, then the question is, you know, what can we recognize as logic? What do we recognize as logic? And therefore, you know, what logics can we use to and apply as intelligence? You know, we hear a lot about machine learning and logics from data, but what if we use the planetary limits as logics? What if we use them to automate decisions in our infrastructures? How could we learn or relearn to design with forms of intelligence that are neither artificial nor human, but come from the environment, emerge from the environment? And what would automation look like in this, you know, in this way? So of course the term natural, so we've been talking about this as a sort of form of natural intelligence. You know, understanding that the term natural is difficult. It's not a, you know, attempt to sort of separate the human out from everything else, nor do we use it to sort of like falsely disguise or hide political questions of automation, but we use it sort of as a provocation to disturb the dualism that's implied by this word artificial and artificial intelligence that sort of hides the labor behind it, the role of the human, environmental extraction that's all necessary in AI. And so this graphic you see shows the logic of the network. The colored lines are, each sort of ring is a server. The yellow shows its solar energy production across time. The graphic shows 72 hours of activity, and those colored lines show that when that server was the active server. So you can see that it's kind of jumping around. The website looks like this. You know, we did a lot of thinking about our design. We don't use JavaScript. The graphics are all generated server side because then we know they're generated by Solar, rather than kind of having the user generate them in their browser where they might be generated by fossil fuel energy or who knows. We also kind of took notes from the Low Tech magazine and tried to reduce the size of our website, reduce the size of our assets, and not use energy intensive tracking technologies. So, right, like I think there's also an interesting political possibility here of a solar powered or low carbon internet would kind of disincentivize the use of surveillance or data-driven practices. Just running through these, so each server steward can also host their own website on their server. So we're hosting one for the Extinction Rebellion Solar Punk Storytelling Contest, and one of our stewards is Anne Pasek, who runs a low carbon research methods group. And so obviously this is also an experiment in kind of low carbon way of working, exploring this question of what does low carbon culture look like. Finally, my last slide, the project is obviously also exploring like decision-making via protocol rather than say via modeling or simulation like we saw in the Asunder work. And I've been very interested in this idea of protocol as a means of environmental governance or environmental management. Very inspired by the work of ecologist Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who looks at plant ecology. She's also an American Indigenous plant ecologist. So she writes a lot about Indigenous protocols as environmental management strategies, right? And a particular one she writes about is called The Honourable Harvest, which is a guide which guides the manner in which we take from the living world. So it defines protocols for asking permission, evaluating impact, taking what you need, using appropriate technology, demonstrating respect and reciprocating the gifts. So this idea of a reciprocal nature, reciprocal relationship with the environment. And so this honourable harvest, you know, has a whole set of rules, like you never take the first plant that you see, or you never take more than half of a number of plants in a region. And so it's actually a deceptively sophisticated species management protocol, ensuring that you're never going to like over extract plants from your bioregion. And so I think this idea of protocol is a very interesting way of sort of, yeah, environmental governance at scale, right? That doesn't rely on super heavy computing or like having to make an exact simulation of the world in order to know how to make decisions better, which is kind of the current imagination for, planetary computing. Okay, I'm sure I'm over time. I kind of lost track of my time, so I'll wrap up there. But thank you very much. I hope that was useful. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Tega. No, you were in time, and it was really interesting and inspiring. And this final quote, really beautiful and appropriate. So thank you very much for your talk. I think there are no questions from the audience in the YouTube chat, but I don't know if we have some time, if any of the projects or speakers want to comment or ask any question before we finish. And if not, well, it has been really inspiring. I think we have listened to a really nice constellation of projects, ideas, all related to this idea of sentient media, medios sintientes. And well, I think they have all in common that they are trying to bring a critical perspective on the technologies of sensing and technologies of representing, and trying to be more inclusive, to bring other perspectives and points of view that are often not taken into account. Hack technologies, all these ideas are like in a common ground in all the projects and ideas that you have been sharing. So I think we have a promising conversation and a very intensive and exciting collaborative prototyping workshop. So I think if there are no more comments, we can finish. Just to remind to all of you who are listening to the webinar that the workshop will take place from the 21st of April to the 4th of May, and that the open call for collaborators is the deadline is the 3rd of April. So until this day you can apply and select any of the projects who will be part of the teams that we will be developing them during the workshop. And then just to remind that tomorrow we will have the other session of the webinar. We will be starting at 5 p.m. Central Europe time, and we will listen to the other 4 projects and other very interesting invited speakers. So goodbye, and thank you very much for all the presentations, and also for the people. Thank you to the people that have been listening, and we hope to see you soon.